Cleveland, in the spring of 1996, was a city caught between grit and renewal. The smell of the lake lingered in the evening air, mixing with the faint aroma of exhaust and fresh pavement. For most, it was just another ordinary Thursday night, but for Laura Bennett, it was the night her life would pivot toward tragedy. At 28, Laura was a beacon in the troubled neighborhood she dedicated herself to. She had worked for nearly a decade with at-risk youth, guiding them through the tumultuous streets of Cleveland's West Side. Her colleagues described her as tireless, compassionate, and relentlessly driven. She had a smile that could cut through despair and eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface, straight to the truth in everyone she met. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. That Thursday evening, Laura was invited to a high-profile charity gala hosted by Thomas Kingsley, a wealthy businessman whose influence in Cleveland extended far beyond the polished marble of his office towers. Kingsley's public image was impeccable: philanthropist, donor to local schools, generous to the arts. But Laura had begun to uncover a different reality, a shadow world behind Kingsley's carefully curated persona. Financial irregularities, off-the-books accounts, secret shell companies, evidence of corruption that, if exposed, could ruin him. She had spent weeks compiling documents, tracing money flows, and connecting dots that suggested not just greed, but connections to organized crime elements in Cleveland and beyond. The gala itself was the kind of event where every movement was calculated. Women in evening gowns glided across the polished floors. Men in tuxedos discussed investments and charity initiatives with a practiced ease. Waiters moved silently, balancing trays of champagne and canapes. Laura entered quietly, holding her small clutch close, her focus divided between polite greetings and scanning the room for familiar faces. Witnesses later recalled seeing her near Kingsley's table around 10:15 p.m. She leaned in toward him, speaking with intensity that drew attention. A few guests noticed the tension etched across her face. Some described Kingsley's smile as tight, measured, almost predatory. It was a polite conversation, but the unease was visible. One attendee, a young journalist covering the gala, remembered Laura turning sharply, her eyes scanning the room before she excused herself. By 10:50 p.m., Laura had left the ballroom. She had told no one she was stepping out. No one could have anticipated that she would never return. Surveillance footage from the gala exit later revealed her walking briskly to the valet, pulling her coat tightly around herself, and disappearing into the night. Detectives who would later revisit the case found her last known movements unsettlingly routine, yet suspicious. Laura had not taken a cab. She had not called friends. She was known to keep meticulous notes on her work, yet no diary entry or phone log indicated where she intended to go. A week later, the city woke to grim news. A body had been discovered in an abandoned steel factory near the waterfront, a hulking relic of Cleveland's industrial past. The building had been shuttered for nearly a decade, rusted beams sagging under the weight of time, graffiti covering the brick walls, and puddles reflecting the dim light from the broken windows. Workers clearing debris had stumbled over the body as they moved old machinery. The medical examiner confirmed what police had feared: it was Laura Bennett. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, a young life extinguished in a place abandoned long ago. The news sent shockwaves through Cleveland. Friends, colleagues, and students mourned her. Community leaders demanded answers. Yet, within hours, the first whispers of obstruction began to surface. Kingsley, when questioned, presented an airtight alibi, complete with a small army of high-profile attorneys. Witnesses who might have seen him near the warehouse that night seemed to evaporate under the subtle pressure of his influence. Some claimed they were too busy to testify. Others were reminded of past favors owed or threats from anonymous sources. The case, once buzzing with investigative energy, began to cool by early 1997, stifled not by lack of evidence but by the invisible weight of power and money. For Detective Michelle Carter, assigned to the case at the time, the chill was personal. She remembered the first time she saw Laura's photograph. A bright face framed in a Polaroid, eyes wide, hair falling across her shoulders. Carter had spent years in homicide, had seen the worst of humanity, but something about Laura's smile lingered. The girl had been ambitious, fearless, determined to right a wrong in her own way. And it had cost her life. Carter pored over every lead, but doors slammed, witnesses turned away, and files went cold. She would carry the unsolved case like a weight in her chest for years. In those early weeks, police interviews tried to reconstruct Laura's final hours. Some attendees at the gala described the confrontation with Kingsley, vague but unsettling remarks exchanged over champagne and canapes. One waiter recalled overhearing Laura mutter, "You can't hide this forever," before storming out. Security footage was limited, the technology of the time rudimentary. Investigators found her apartment meticulously organized, evidence of her dedication to her work scattered across her desk. Ledgers, photocopies of bank statements, cryptic notes about shell companies tied to Kingsley. Despite the gaps, one detail stood out. Laura had been digging into Kingsley's financial dealings, piecing together a puzzle that had clearly rattled him. Detective Carter realized early that the motive for murder was likely tied to these discoveries. But proving it? That was another matter entirely. Months passed. Leads went cold. Carter, frustrated and increasingly isolated in her pursuit, began to see patterns of obstruction not just in the courthouse but on the street. Informants who might have helped vanished. Witnesses reported receiving veiled threats. Anonymous phone calls warned against further probing. The very system meant to deliver justice seemed bent on protecting a powerful man. Even within the precinct, whispers circulated. "Kingsley's untouchable," said one veteran detective, shaking his head. "You push too hard. You'll be the next one sidelined." But Carter refused to give in. She returned night after night to Laura's file, reviewing the financial documents she had recovered, trying to connect one small thread to the larger tapestry. Each name, each transaction, each memo was a potential key. One particularly cold December evening, Carter sat alone in the dimly lit office. Outside, the snow fell in thick, muffling flakes, coating the streets in silence. She thumbed through Laura's notebook, noting references to payments, dates, and meetings with Kingsley that didn't appear in public records. Her fingers traced the handwriting, imagining Laura feverishly scribbling notes late into the night, determined to expose corruption. Carter's reflection in the window merged with Laura's image on the file, a ghostly reminder of a life cut short. The investigation had also uncovered confidential financial reports hinting at Kingsley's ties to illegal loans, money laundering, and shell corporations designed to funnel wealth offshore. Laura had compiled a partial ledger, noting dates, sums, and possible beneficiaries. Carter knew that these documents were critical. They weren't enough on their own, but they provided context. Why someone would want Laura silenced, why the case grew cold so quickly. Community outreach added another layer to the case. Friends and family spoke of Laura's relentless advocacy for vulnerable teens. Teachers recalled how she spent evenings tutoring students who would otherwise fall through the cracks. Social workers described her as tireless, someone who believed in second chances. These accounts painted a picture of a woman whose integrity and determination made her both admired and, apparently, feared. By early 1997, the official case file labeled Laura Bennett's murder unsolved, but for Detective Carter, the story didn't end there. She spent weekends re-interviewing witnesses, poring over old bank statements, and revisiting the factory site. Even decades-old surveillance footage, grainy and incomplete, was scrutinized for every movement, every shadow, every detail. She began compiling her own chronology, noting inconsistencies in Kingsley's alibi, tracking dates of unexplained financial withdrawals, and cataloging witnesses who reported intimidation. Despite setbacks, Carter never lost focus. She understood that the truth might be delayed, but it was never truly gone. Each new piece of evidence, every overlooked document, every memory recounted by a witness, was a small victory. Each night, she would sit in her car, staring at the factory from across the empty lot, imagining Laura walking through those halls, piecing together evidence, determined to uncover the truth no one else dared pursue. Even as years passed, Carter's obsession didn't wane. By 2000, she had transferred to a specialized unit focusing on cold cases, quietly bringing Laura's file with her. It was a reminder, a challenge, and a promise. The truth didn't die with the victim, and someone would have to pay for the life taken in that abandoned factory. As Carter leaned back in her chair, late one night in 2000, the file open before her, she whispered to herself, a vow more than a statement. I will find out who did this. Laura deserves justice, and I won't stop until she gets it. And as the city slept under the dim glow of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic along the river, Detective Michelle Carter's resolve crystallized. This case would not remain in the shadows. Every ledger, every note, every witness, no matter how buried, would be unearthed. And when the time came, the world would see what Cleveland already knew in its quiet moments. That power and money could delay justice, but they could not stop it. But for now, the city rested, unaware that the first real threads of the truth were beginning to unravel. Threads that would lead to a reckoning years in the making. What would you do if you uncovered secrets so dangerous that simply knowing them put your life at risk? Could you stay silent, or would you fight to reveal the truth, no matter the cost? Detective Michelle Carter had spent the better part of a decade buried in paperwork and minor cases when whispers about Thomas Kingsley began to resurface in 2004. Cleveland hadn't forgotten the disappearance of Laura Bennett, though many preferred to act as if the case had simply evaporated with time. Yet, in hushed corners of city bars, in dimly lit diners, and across water-stained office walls, rumors circulated. Kingsley's philanthropic empire, the public image of the benevolent businessman supporting schools, youth programs, and hospitals, was merely a facade. Behind the carefully curated charity events and handshakes with the mayor, his wealth was entangled in underground operations reaching as far as Detroit. The rumors came piecemeal at first. Whispers of money laundering, connections to Detroit crime families, and unexplained disappearances of employees who asked too many questions. Most of these claims were never substantiated, at least not in a way the press could publish. But Carter's instincts, honed by years of navigating convoluted criminal networks and high-profile cases, told her something was wrong. She knew Laura Bennett hadn't simply vanished because of bad luck or random violence. Meanwhile, Laura's sister, Margaret Bennett Cole, refused to let the world forget. In the years after the original investigation fizzled out, she quietly pieced together what she could, balancing a full-time job and raising 2 children while methodically reviewing Kingsley's known associates, financial filings, and old charity records. Margaret's home office was a labyrinth of binders, photographs, and legal documents, each carefully labeled and dated. She had become a ghost investigator in her own right, sending letters and emails to former Kingsley employees, piecing together fragments of a story that never fully aligned with the official narrative. It wasn't until 2009, however, that the case gained traction again. Carter had transferred into the Major Crimes Unit, a promotion she had earned through years of dedication, intuition, and relentless pursuit of truth. One chilly February morning, she found herself staring at Laura's original file for hours, poring over reports that now seemed deliberately incomplete. Something about the case had always nagged at her. The missing photographs, the altered witness statements, and the inexplicable gaps in timelines that no one had adequately explained. Carter noticed, for example, that Officer Reynolds' original report listed Laura leaving the gala at 10:50 p.m., yet several eyewitnesses who had given statements at the time recalled seeing her in the parking area closer to 11:15 p.m. Small discrepancies like that were usually brushed off, dismissed as the unreliability of memory, but Carter's gut told her they were significant. Someone had manipulated the case file, and not incompetently. They had erased or altered specific pieces of evidence to create a veneer of order. Her initial attempts to push the case forward were met with polite but firm resistance from the Cleveland DA's office. Thomas Kingsley is untouchable, one senior prosecutor told her, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. You'll spend years trying to build a case that will never see a jury. His connections, his lawyers, the money, don't even go there. You'll get frustrated, and someone might get hurt. Carter had filed her own internal memo, noting the warning, but determined not to let it intimidate her. By 2010, Carter had begun to map Kingsley's known associates, cross-referencing them with the rumors linking him to Detroit. One evening, she sat in her small Cleveland apartment surrounded by spreadsheets and old phone logs. Her eyes flicked between a photograph of Kingsley shaking hands with the mayor in 1995 and an old payroll ledger from one of his shell companies. "There's a pattern here," she muttered to herself. "Something's being funneled, moved, hidden." The thought that the same man responsible for Laura's death might still be running operations quietly under the guise of philanthropy made her stomach churn. Margaret continued her parallel investigation, often calling Carter with updates or sending her scanned copies of documents. In one email, Margaret included an old memo from Laura's workplace suggesting that she had been gathering sensitive financial documents about Kingsley's companies in the weeks before her disappearance. Another email had handwritten notes from a former Kingsley assistant, noting that Laura had been seen speaking with someone identified only as M.R., a name Carter traced to Michael Raines, an accountant who disappeared in Detroit under mysterious circumstances in 1998. The first breakthrough came in early 2013. Carter received an anonymous voicemail on her secure office line. The voice was hesitant but insistent, almost trembling. "Detective Carter, you need to listen. Laura didn't die instantly. I have evidence. I can't explain everything over the phone, but if you find me, I can prove it. Please, hurry." Carter replayed the message several times, straining to catch the inflections and any hint of location. She traced the call to a suburban Cleveland exchange. The person who had left the voicemail, Linda Barrett, had once been Kingsley's personal assistant, a woman known for her meticulous record-keeping and near-obsessive loyalty. Her name had come up several times in Margaret's research, though she had long since vanished from public records. Carter coordinated with the tech team to locate her. For a brief moment, it seemed like the pieces of the puzzle might finally come together. But before they could reach her, Linda disappeared without a trace. Her apartment was empty, save for a note left on her desk. Some truths are better left buried. The sudden vanishing of Barrett reignited the sense of urgency. Carter knew, with absolute clarity, that someone powerful, someone with resources and foresight, was actively ensuring that those who knew too much were removed. She felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The trail was cold, but it was also dangerous. One misstep, and the investigation could be derailed permanently, or worse, the people trying to help could be harmed. Carter arranged meetings with the remaining witnesses, meticulously re-examining every detail of the 1996 investigation. The original crime scene photographs had faded, yet subtle anomalies were detectable. Laura's body, as captured in the black and white photos, showed evidence of defensive wounds that had never been emphasized in the initial reports. Broken fingernails, bruising along her forearms, small details that suggested Laura had struggled longer than previously noted, and that the staging of the scene as a robbery had been more deliberate than anyone realized. Interviews with original witnesses revealed new insights as well. One of Laura's co-workers, Helen Marino, admitted that she had been coerced into omitting certain details from her statement. "I was scared," she confessed, eyes downcast. "I didn't want anyone to know what I had seen. They threatened me. I didn't know who it was, but I knew it was connected to Kingsley." Carter took careful notes, realizing the depth of fear and influence Kingsley had wielded, even from outside the public eye. The DA's office remained cautious. While supportive of her thorough approach, they continued to emphasize the risks of pursuing a man with Kingsley's stature. "This isn't just a case," one assistant prosecutor said during a strategy meeting. "It's a web of influence, money, and fear that stretches beyond Cleveland. You move on this without absolute proof, and the fallout will be catastrophic. We could lose years of credibility and potentially lives." Carter simply nodded. The warnings were expected, but she refused to be deterred. Laura's memory and the possibility of justice demanded action. By mid-2013, Carter's persistence began to pay off. Through painstaking investigation, she uncovered financial ledgers showing unexplained cash transfers around the time of Laura's disappearance. Some transfers were small, almost insignificant, but others were substantial. Payments to individuals whose identities could not be immediately verified. One entry, dated October 13, 1996, listed a large withdrawal that aligned suspiciously with the timeline of Laura's disappearance. Carter cross-referenced it with Margaret's findings, noting that this was the same day Laura had allegedly been gathering sensitive documents. The pieces were beginning to converge, forming a coherent pattern where once there had been only rumor and suspicion. Carter also began reaching out to former Kingsley employees, people who had left under uneasy circumstances. Each meeting was fraught with tension. Many refused to speak outright, citing fear for themselves or their families. One former accountant, willing to talk only under the condition of anonymity, revealed that Kingsley had a history of intimidation, often using threats veiled as professional warnings. If you ask too many questions, things happen. Jobs disappear, people move, sometimes permanently, the accountant said, voice low. Carter's mind immediately connected this with the disappearance of Linda Barrett. Someone didn't want the truth coming out, and they were willing to enforce that silence. As the summer months of 2013 passed, Carter began mapping connections between Kingsley, the missing assistant, and the residual network of influence he still commanded. Detroit rumors, previously dismissed as idle gossip, suddenly appeared credible. Carter traced phone calls, cross-referenced payrolls, and even reviewed old charitable contracts that hinted at illicit operations running alongside legitimate businesses. It became clear that Laura had stumbled into a world of shadow dealings far beyond what anyone had initially realized, and that someone had been determined to ensure she could never tell the truth. Late one night in September, Carter sat alone in the major crimes office, the glow from her desk lamp illuminating a wall of case photographs and spreadsheets. She studied Laura's photographs, the faded crime scene prints, and the ledger entries Margaret had provided. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility and the enormity of the task ahead. Every connection, every lead, felt like a thread pulling her deeper into a dangerous labyrinth. She replayed Linda Barrett's voicemail over and over, listening for inflections, for clues to location, for any hint of how much that woman had seen. Margaret, ever vigilant, continued her work in parallel. She compiled notes from family members, colleagues, and distant friends, uncovering inconsistencies in Kingsley's own public statements. A gala in 1996, for instance, had been promoted as a purely charitable event, yet several anonymous attendees confirmed seeing Kingsley slip away for private meetings that evening. Nothing concrete, but enough to suggest that Laura's suspicions had been well-founded. By the end of 2013, Detective Carter had pieced together a troubling picture. Laura Bennett's death was not a random act of violence. It had been calculated, motivated by exposure, and protected for years by wealth and influence. The anonymous voicemail, the sudden disappearance of Linda Barrett, the financial irregularities, and the silenced witnesses all pointed to a man who would kill to protect his secrets, or at least someone in his orbit would. Carter leaned back in her chair and whispered almost to herself, "Someone's still alive who knows everything, and someone else is making sure she never talks." She stared at the caseboard, tracing lines between photos, ledger entries, and faded documents. The cold case had refused to die, and now it demanded answers that no one could delay any longer. It was clear that the next phase of investigation would be the most dangerous yet. Kingsley's reach was long, his influence deep, and anyone daring to unravel the threads of his empire risked drawing attention in ways they could not predict. Yet, Carter had no choice. Laura Bennett deserved more than whispers and rumors. She deserved justice, even if the cost was high. As she closed her office for the night, locking the case files in the cabinet, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past, though long buried, was bleeding into the present. And the truth, finally, was close enough to touch. But one question lingered in her mind as she drove through the empty Cleveland streets. Who else had survived to see what happened that night in 1996? And who would ensure that they stayed silent? The spring of 2017 brought a cold, biting wind to Detroit, the kind that seemed to carry whispers of past sins. Detective Michelle Carter had flown up from Cleveland after a tip from an informant, one that could finally break open the walls of silence surrounding Laura Bennett's disappearance. Bobby Serrano, Kingsley's former enforcer, was sitting in a small interrogation room. Cuffed to the table, his eyes darting between the investigators as though he expected them to vanish at any moment. "Let's be honest," Carter said, leaning forward, her hands clasped on the table. "You've been protecting him for decades, but right now, the only protection you have is the truth." Serrano snorted, a humorless sound, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Truth?" he said. "You don't know what truth means in this city. I've seen people die for less than a whisper." "But you've come here," Carter pressed, "which means you want out. That's your chance. We can make a deal. You tell us what happened the night Laura Bennett disappeared, and you go home without the rest of this hanging over you." The enforcer shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. His lips twisted into a bitter grin. "You know what I saw? I saw Kingsley with her. That girl, she had something he needed destroyed, something that could have taken everything from him if it ever got out." Torres, sitting silently in the corner, made notes with careful precision. Carter glanced at him. "We're listening. Every word matters." Serrano exhaled sharply. He didn't kill her right there, not immediately. He wanted leverage. But when she realized the danger she was in, well, let's just say she didn't make it out alive. "Where?" Carter asked. He hesitated. "There's a place, not far from the Detroit warehouse district, locked up tight. Ledgers, photos, proof of all the deals, all the money, all the corruption. He stashed it in a safe no one knew about." Torres raised an eyebrow. "Can you take us there?" Serrano's grin faded. "I can, but if I die, the world will never know what I've said. You get it?" Carter nodded. "We'll protect you, every step of the way." Meanwhile, in Toledo, Linda Barrett remained in hiding. Since disappearing in 2013, she had lived under false names, moving constantly to avoid being found. But after months of anonymous messages promising safety, she finally contacted Carter. Her voice, shaky but determined, recounted the night Laura vanished. She had been working as Kingsley's personal assistant, privy to the financial records, the secret accounts, the transfers that made his public persona a lie. "I know what he did," Barrett said. "I've kept quiet out of fear, but I can testify. I saw him threaten her. I saw him manipulate every piece of evidence afterward. He wanted to make sure no one ever knew what he did." Carter felt a familiar chill. "And since 2013? "I've been careful," Barrett admitted. "I've avoided being seen, stayed off the radar, but I'm scared. He's got people everywhere. If he finds me, I'm done for." Torres and Carter exchanged a look. The stakes were escalating. Witnesses were coming forward, but the threats against them were growing just as fast. 2 minor witnesses, delivery drivers who had unknowingly seen suspicious movements around Kingsley's properties in 1996, had been attacked in late 2017. Both refused to cooperate, terrified that the Kingsley network would reach them as well. Carter made note. The more truth emerges, the greater the danger. Back in Detroit, Serrano led the team to a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The building reeked of rust and abandonment, graffiti layered over decades of decay. Serrano moved with a nervous precision, guiding the officers to a hidden hatch beneath a stack of broken pallets. Inside, a metal container, sealed and marked with Kingsley's cryptic insignia, contained evidence that had remained untouched for more than 2 decades. Carter carefully removed the contents: yellowed ledgers with detailed financial transactions, photographs of Kingsley with influential figures, and documents hinting at ties to Detroit's underground operations. It was enough to connect him to the kind of corruption Laura had uncovered, the kind that could ruin reputations and destroy lives. "This is it," Carter murmured. "This is what she found." Torres nodded, carefully photographing every piece of evidence. "It's airtight. Combined with Serrano's testimony, Barrett's account, we can finally bring him down." Cleveland, meanwhile, buzzed with rumors. The public had no idea of the inner workings of Kingsley's empire, but whispers of his influence in Detroit's underground had begun to circulate among journalists and insiders. Margaret Bennett Cole had never stopped pushing, even as the media tried to silence her after years of no progress. She continued to investigate quietly, reaching out to old contacts, following threads that others ignored. Each piece of information she discovered reinforced the nightmare that Laura had lived and ultimately died because of. Carter and Margaret coordinated tirelessly. Every witness had to be protected. Every step documented meticulously. The stakes were clear. Kingsley had survived decades because people were too afraid to confront him. That had to end. The public confrontation arrived unexpectedly. In February 2018, Kingsley hosted a charity banquet in downtown Cleveland. It was a glittering event, attended by political figures, business magnates, and media personalities. Carter and her team arrived in plainclothes, blending into the crowd. When the moment came, uniformed officers entered discreetly, surrounding Kingsley without causing panic. The man who had appeared untouchable, a pillar of the community, was led away in handcuffs before the banquet guests could even react. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and social media erupted. Crowds of onlookers gathered outside, murmuring in disbelief. Carter met Kingsley's gaze as he was escorted through the marble foyer. His expression remained calm, cold, calculated. "You're about to start a war you can't win," he said quietly, almost conversationally. "I don't intend to," Carter replied. "I intend to bring justice." Even in custody, Kingsley's presence commanded attention. He sat in the detention room, arms crossed, surveying every person in the room like a general on a battlefield. Marcus Feldman, his lead attorney, was equally composed, already plotting motions, appeals, and delays. Carter knew the legal battle ahead would be grueling. They were about to challenge a man who had manipulated law and power for decades. But now, armed with Serrano's testimony, Barrett's return, and the hidden ledgers, they had a chance the city had never seen before. Margaret's home became a temporary command post for parts of the investigation. On a late spring evening, as she sifted through the latest reports and photographs, she heard a subtle click outside the window. Moving cautiously, she discovered the door had been forced slightly ajar. Inside, her home had been rifled through, drawers opened, furniture overturned, papers scattered. But nothing appeared stolen. On the kitchen table was a single envelope, typed neatly, with a note, "Stop digging or someone else disappears." Her heart raced. The warning was unmistakable. Carter and Torres arrived moments later, surveying the scene. Fingerprints yielded nothing. Whoever had entered had moved professionally, methodically. "Kingsley has reach," Torres said grimly. "Even in custody, his influence stretches far." Carter placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We move forward. That's the only way to protect everyone and bring this to a close." Over the next months, the investigation grew more complex. Barrett remained in Toledo under protection, providing critical information about Kingsley's operations, his network of loyalists, and the methods used to intimidate witnesses. Serrano continued cooperating with authorities, though the fear he carried was palpable. Minor witnesses were placed in safe houses, their memories meticulously documented. Every piece of evidence had to be cross-checked, verified, and double-checked for authenticity. As the trial preparations began, the team faced the reality that this case would not be simple. Kingsley's attorneys attempted to discredit every witness, challenge every document, and paint the narrative as speculation and rumor. Yet the mounting pile of records, photographs, and first-hand accounts formed an unshakable foundation. The empire that had seemed invincible for decades was finally showing cracks. One evening, as Carter reviewed surveillance footage from one of the safe houses, she noticed the pattern. Someone had been shadowing witnesses, testing security measures, checking vulnerabilities. It was subtle, professional. Margaret, reading over Carter's shoulder, frowned. "They're trying to intimidate anyone who talks. This isn't just Kingsley's fight anymore. It's anyone who helps him lose." Torres added, "We're going to need a plan for every witness, every piece of evidence, every move in court. One slip, and this case could collapse." Carter leaned back, the weight of the past 20 years pressing down on her. "No, we don't stop now. Laura deserves this. Everyone who risked themselves deserves this. This empire has held sway for too long. It ends here." The final days before the public trial were tense. Lawyers exchanged documents in preparation, Witnesses were briefed, and the city watched in a state of hushed fascination. The media, once indifferent or intimidated, now reported relentlessly on the unraveling of Kingsley's empire. Every revelation, every leaked ledger entry, every testimony preview fueled public outrage and interest. Carter, Margaret, and Torres gathered one last time in a quiet office overlooking Cleveland's skyline. "Everyone ready?" Carter asked. Margaret nodded, determination set in her eyes. "Ready, no turning back now." Torres added, "We move forward, step by step. Keep everyone safe, keep the focus on the evidence." And then, as night fell, Margaret received a text from her security detail. A minor breach at one of the witness locations. The words were simple, terrifying. "Stop digging or someone else disappears." Margaret stared at the message, her mind racing. She thought of Laura, of Barrett, of all the witnesses who had risked everything to tell the truth. Turning to Carter, she said quietly, "Do you ever wonder how far people are willing to go to protect the secrets of the powerful, and how far we're willing to go to expose them?" Carter met her gaze, her jaw set. "I guess that's the question, isn't it? How much is justice worth when the cost is this high?" The message confirmed what they all feared. Kingsley's empire, though cracked, still wielded power. But now, facing the combined force of justice, truth, and courage, it was only a matter of time before the full story came to light. The winter of 2019 in Cleveland was sharp and unrelenting, but inside the courthouse, heat and tension combined to make the atmosphere almost unbearable. News crews lined the street outside the ornate limestone building, their cameras poised to capture every moment of what was already being dubbed the trial of the century. Headlines screamed across local papers and national networks. Cleveland millionaire accused of murdering social worker 23 years ago. It was a story of wealth, corruption, and a young woman's life stolen in the shadows of the city. For Detective Michelle Carter, the case had consumed years of her life, and now, with the charges officially filed against Thomas Kingsley, the real test began. The prosecution team, led by the tenacious and meticulous Assistant District Attorney Patricia Vasquez, had spent months preparing. Every deposition, every piece of evidence, and every witness statement had been meticulously reviewed and cross-referenced. Margaret Bennett Cole, Laura's sister, had been reluctant at first to participate in the trial, wary of reliving the trauma and exposing herself to public scrutiny. Yet, she understood the stakes. Her sister's life, her story, demanded to be told. On the first day of trial, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The jury, a cross-section of the city, had been selected after painstaking vetting. 7 women, 5 men, ages ranging from 28 to 67, each bringing their own experiences, biases, and preconceptions. The foreperson, a middle-aged accountant, exuded quiet diligence. A man who would be tasked with weighing decades of conflicting testimony and deciding whether a man with immense influence was guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Vasquez rose first, her presence commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but filled with quiet fire. "You are about to hear a story that spans more than 2 decades. It is a story about a young woman who dedicated her life to helping others, and it is a story about a man who sought to protect his own secrets at any cost." She paused, allowing her words to hang in the room, heavy with implication. She walked slowly, methodically toward the jury. Laura Bennett was 19 years old when her life was taken. She was vibrant, compassionate, and determined. She worked with troubled teens, offering guidance, support, and a future that many feared they would never have. But on October 10, 1996, she encountered someone who saw her courage as a threat. Vasquez laid out the timeline with precision, referencing documents, photos, and forensic evidence. That night, at a charity gala, Laura confronted Thomas Kingsley. What began as an attempt to expose his corruption ended in her death. She left the gala alive, but she never returned home. She displayed faded photographs of the abandoned steel factory by the waterfront where Laura's body had been found. Defensive wounds on her hands, signs of a struggle, lay preserved in grim but unambiguous detail. She fought for her life, Vasquez said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet every word reached the jury. And yet, she did not survive. When the defense rose, Kingsley's attorney, Marcus Feldman, portrayed a sharply different narrative. His opening statement was measured, articulate, and dripping with righteous indignation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Feldman began, gesturing toward Kingsley, who sat composed and dignified, "you are being asked to judge a man based not on hard evidence but on rumor, hearsay, and conjecture. My client has spent a lifetime serving this city, mentoring young attorneys, supporting charitable organizations, and upholding the law, and now, decades later, he is accused of a crime that cannot be proven beyond reasonable doubt." Feldman's words carried a persuasive weight, and for a moment, the courtroom seemed suspended between two realities, one of a murdered young woman whose life had been stolen, and one of a respected, powerful man whose reputation had been unblemished for decades. The first week of the trial focused on establishing the timeline of Laura Bennett's disappearance and death. The original medical examiner, now retired at age 89, was called to testify. Despite the years, he remained sharp, his memory precise. He detailed the autopsy findings: blunt force trauma to the head, injuries consistent with being struck by a heavy object, and defensive wounds indicating a struggle. "She did not go quietly," he emphasized, pointing to photographs preserved from the 1996 investigation. "These injuries suggest a fight for survival. She resisted." Outside the courtroom, the media coverage intensified. Cameras followed every movement of Margaret and the prosecution team, while reporters speculated endlessly on whether Kingsley's wealth and influence would shield him from conviction. Margaret tried to maintain composure, but late at night in her apartment, she often stared at Laura's photograph, whispering a silent promise, "I will not let her story end here." The second week brought Dorothy Callahan's deposition into play. Though Dorothy had passed away shortly before the trial, her videotaped testimony was admissible. The jury watched intently as Dorothy, calm and deliberate, described the evidence her husband, a former investigator, had meticulously preserved. She spoke of photographs, ledgers, and letters that detailed Kingsley's affairs and financial manipulations, evidence that had been buried for over 2 decades. Feldman objected repeatedly, citing broken chain of custody and potential contamination. Judge Reynolds, a veteran jurist known for her even-handedness, overruled most objections, ruling that the evidence was crucial to establishing motive and opportunity. One piece of evidence stood out in particular: the blackmail letter Laura had written, demanding $50,000 to keep Kingsley's affairs private. Handwriting experts confirmed the signature matched Laura's known writing samples. The jury murmured as the typed document was projected onto a large screen, showing the calculated, precise words of a young woman who had been brave enough to confront danger head-on. Linda Barrett, Kingsley's former personal assistant, took the stand mid-trial. Her appearance was dramatic. She entered quietly, head bowed, eyes wary. The court watched as she described her intimate knowledge of Kingsley's operations and her presence during key moments leading up to Laura's death. Laura confronted him, Barrett testified, her voice trembling but clear. She told him she had evidence that could ruin him. He didn't want to risk it. He lured her to the factory under the guise of paying her off. That's where it happened. Feldman's cross-examination was fierce. He questioned Barrett's credibility, highlighting her history with Kingsley and suggesting possible bias. "You have nothing to gain by speaking the truth now, except to damage a man you once served," Feldman argued. Barrett held her ground, tears welling but voice firm. "I am speaking for Laura," she said. "I owe her that much." Bobby Serrano, Kingsley's former enforcer, testified shortly after. His presence brought a tangible tension to the courtroom. The man had seen firsthand the dark underbelly of Kingsley's empire. Serrano described his role in cleaning up the aftermath at the factory, reluctantly admitting to helping move evidence. He explained that Laura possessed documents and photographs that could have exposed Kingsley. "She had something he needed destroyed," Serrano stated plainly. "I saw him with her that night. Things went wrong. She refused to back down. He didn't stop." The defense attacked Serrano's credibility, painting him as a man with a criminal past seeking a deal. But the prosecution's meticulous documentation of his testimony, corroborated by financial records and witness accounts, made him difficult to dismiss entirely. Throughout the trial, both Margaret and Carter watched as their efforts, painstakingly assembled over decades, were put to the ultimate test. They endured long days, often late into the evening, revisiting evidence, preparing questions, and bracing for the defense's counterattacks. Threats against witnesses remained a concern, security had been increased, and protective measures were in place. Even with these precautions, the tension in the courthouse was palpable, a constant reminder that Kingsley's reach and influence were far from gone. Margaret was called to testify in late 2021. Standing in the witness box, she felt a mixture of grief, anger, and determination. Laura was more than a statistic, she told the jury. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had dreams, ambitions, and a bright future. She was taken from us by a man who valued his reputation above a human life. Her testimony humanized Laura, bringing the girl's story to life beyond the cold facts and timelines. Jurors leaned forward, some visibly moved, as Margaret recounted memories, conversations, and Laura's unwavering sense of justice. Cross-examination attempted to undermine Margaret's emotional testimony. Feldman argued that grief could color her perception, that decades of waiting and media coverage might have influenced her memory. Margaret remained resolute. "My grief doesn't change what happened," she said firmly. "It only reminds us why the truth matters." Outside the courtroom, public opinion raged. Social media erupted with debates. News outlets published editorials questioning whether a man of Kingsley's stature could be held accountable, and opinion polls divided sharply along generational lines. For many, it was more than a trial. It was a reckoning with power, privilege, and the ability of justice to reach across decades. By early 2022, after nearly 3 years of preparation, testimony, and legal maneuvering, closing arguments arrived. Vasquez presented the prosecution's case with careful precision, replaying Callahan's tape, revisiting the photographs, letters, and witness statements. She emphasized the pattern of intimidation and secrecy Kingsley had employed to shield himself, the consequences of which had left Laura's family in anguish for decades. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," she reminded the jury, "but it is fragile, and it is your responsibility to restore it where it has been stolen." Feldman's closing was an impassioned defense of Kingsley's lifetime of service and the insufficiency of evidence to meet the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury of the years that had passed, the inconsistencies in witness recollections, and the speculative nature of some testimony. "You cannot condemn a man to the rest of his life based on suspicion," he urged. "This is not justice. This is retribution." Margaret sat silently as the jury was excused to deliberate. Her mind replayed every step, every witness, every piece of evidence that had brought them to this moment. Carter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've done everything we can," he said softly. "Now it's in their hands." As the jury filed out, Margaret's voice barely audible, she asked herself a question she knew she couldn't answer alone. "After everything we've seen, what would you do if you were in their place?" The question lingered, a natural reflection for anyone witnessing the pursuit of justice decades after a life had been stolen. The courtroom emptied, leaving a heavy stillness. Outside, the winter sky had darkened, streetlights casting long shadows across the plaza. Margaret walked alone for a moment, letting the cold wind sweep over her, grounding her in the reality that soon the jury's decision would bring closure or prolong the agony. The clock ticked relentlessly. Hours passed. 12 hours. 16. Margaret remained in her seat, hands clasped tightly around her coat. Carter paced quietly at the edge of the room, keeping vigilant watch, phone at the ready for any updates. The tension was almost unbearable. Finally, a message arrived. The jury had reached a verdict. Margaret drew a deep breath and straightened her posture. The judge called the courtroom back to order. Kingsley, sitting composed until this moment, shifted slightly, eyes scanning the room with that same calculated calm that had unnerved so many witnesses over the years. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Reynolds asked, her voice clear, authoritative. The foreperson, standing tall, cleared his throat. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree." Margaret's heart thundered in her chest. Time seemed to slow. "We find the defendant, Thomas Kingsley, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and vindication. Carter exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Feldman's face remained stoic, though his lips pressed tightly together, a subtle sign of the storm of appeals that would surely follow. Kingsley sat frozen, his calm facade finally cracking, eyes wide, jaw tight. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed relentlessly. Reporters clamored for statements. Margaret stepped forward, choosing her words carefully. "Today, 23 years after Laura Bennett was taken from us, justice has been served. This verdict does not bring her back, but it restores her dignity, and it honors the truth. No one, regardless of wealth or influence, is above the law." The city exhaled a collective sigh, relief and astonishment intertwining. Families who had followed the case for years celebrated quietly, while others debated the implications of a trial that had spanned decades and tested the limits of the legal system. For Margaret and Carter, there was a brief moment of triumph, but also reflection. The case had demanded everything: their time, their energy, their peace of mind. And yet, the story of Laura Bennett, the young woman who had dared to confront corruption, had finally been honored. The verdict had finally been rendered. After months of deliberation, cross-examinations, and courtroom drama, Thomas Kingsley had been convicted of first-degree murder. The words had hung heavy in the air, reverberating through the courthouse like a distant storm. Guilty. It was a verdict decades in the making, the culmination of countless hours of painstaking investigation, fearless testimony, and relentless pursuit of the truth by those who refused to let a powerful man manipulate justice. Inside the courthouse, Kingsley's reaction stunned everyone. For years, he had presented an unshakable veneer of composure, the calm, measured patriarch, the untouchable titan of Cleveland's business and philanthropic circles. But now, as the foreperson delivered the verdict, his shoulders sagged, eyes widening in disbelief, mouth trembling. He swallowed hard, then sank into his chair. His lawyers scrambled to comfort him, but it was clear, for the first time in his life, he had lost control. The judge's gavel brought the courtroom to silence. "Thomas Kingsley, based on the evidence presented in the jury's verdict, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. May this judgment serve as a testament to the principle that no one, regardless of power, is above the law." A murmur swept through the room. Kingsley's empire, built meticulously over decades, began to crumble with shocking immediacy. Board members resigned, charitable foundations severed ties, and the media speculated on the cascading financial consequences. Within hours, the once untouchable mogul had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that wealth and influence could not indefinitely shield one from accountability. Margaret Bennett Cole sat rigidly in the front row, eyes fixed on Kingsley. She felt a complex tangle of emotions: vindication, grief, and a quiet sorrow for the life her sister had lost. Even as justice had been delivered, nothing could truly replace Laura. Margaret's hands gripped the folded courtroom transcript, a tangible symbol of years of unrelenting pursuit. She whispered a silent prayer, her voice carried only by the stillness of the courtroom. "Rest now, Laura. Your story is finally told." Detective Michelle Carter watched the scene unfold with measured satisfaction. Years of dogged work had led to this moment. But as the courtroom emptied, she felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over her. She had given her life to cases like this, to uncovering truths hidden beneath decades of deception. Yet, even as triumph was achieved, the toll was undeniable. By the time the sentencing formalities were complete, Carter knew she could no longer continue in the field. She had spent decades in law enforcement, navigating the murky intersections of power, corruption, and human tragedy. This case had defined her career, shaped her life, and tested her in ways she could never have anticipated. The decision to retire, though difficult, was certain. She wanted to leave the force knowing that she had done everything possible to honor Laura Bennett, and the countless victims whose voices had been silenced. Outside the courthouse, the city of Cleveland seemed to breathe a collective sigh. Citizens who had followed the trial for years spoke quietly among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others in relief. For many, it was a moment of justice, long delayed but profoundly meaningful. Margaret and Carter walked side by side toward the waiting car. For a moment, neither spoke, allowing the crisp February air to fill the silence, heavy with reflection. Over the next few weeks, Kingsley's life unraveled further. His high-profile law firm faced an exodus of partners. His charitable foundations announced closures or transferred leadership to independent boards. And his business holdings, once considered impregnable, faced intense scrutiny, litigation, and divestment. Every asset, every relationship, and every veneer of respectability Kingsley had cultivated over decades disintegrated. What had once been untouchable power now resembled a brittle house of cards, collapsing under the weight of truth and accountability. For Margaret and Carter, the post-trial period was quieter but no less profound. Carter spent her final days at the precinct organizing case files, ensuring that Laura's investigation and the supporting evidence were archived meticulously. It was a necessary task, not only for the historical record, but to ensure that future investigators could reference and learn from the methods that had brought a dangerous criminal to justice after decades. Margaret assisted in gathering personal items and photographs of Laura for a final memorial, determined that her sister's legacy would be honored appropriately. By the spring of 2023, preparations for a memorial at Lake Erie in Sandusky were underway. The location was chosen carefully, a peaceful spot along the shoreline, far from the glare of media and the distractions of the city. It would be a place for quiet reflection, for remembering Laura as she truly was, a young woman full of life, passion, and courage. A simple bench with a brass plaque bearing her name was installed, facing the vast expanse of water. It was a place where anyone who had loved her or sought to honor her memory could sit and reflect. On a clear, sunny morning, Margaret arrived at the memorial, accompanied by her teenage daughter, Emily. The breeze from Lake Erie carried the scent of water and the faint cries of gulls overhead. Margaret knelt briefly to touch the bench, her fingers brushing the engraved letters. Emily watched quietly, her own eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and reverence. She would have loved this place, Margaret said softly. She always loved water, calm places, places where you could think, really think. Emily nodded, still absorbing the weight of decades of loss. I wish I could have met her, she murmured. You did, in a way, Margaret replied, her voice tinged with both sorrow and pride. You carry her spirit, her courage, her compassion, and one day you'll tell her story too. As they sat together, a familiar figure approached, Detective Carter. She had arrived quietly, unannounced, leaving the press and cameras far behind. She had wanted this final moment to be intimate, without spectacle, a simple acknowledgement of the years of work, grief, and perseverance that had led to this day. Margaret rose to greet her. I wasn't sure if you'd come, she admitted. I wouldn't miss it, Carter said, her expression warm but reflective. Laura deserves this. All she ever wanted was for the truth to be known. I'm just glad we could finally give it to her. The three of them stood silently, looking out over the water. For a long moment, words seemed unnecessary. The lake's gentle waves lapped against the shoreline, each ripple echoing the passage of time, the weight of memories, and the resilience of truth. Finally, Margaret spoke. It's hard to believe it's really over. After all these years, it is, Carter replied, her voice quiet but firm. But over doesn't mean forgotten, it never will be. She turned her gaze toward the bench. Justice doesn't erase grief. It doesn't restore the years lost or the moments stolen. But it restores the truth. And sometimes, that's the most powerful thing we can give a family, a community, or even ourselves. Emily, still sitting on the bench, ran her fingers lightly across the engraved name. Do you think people will remember her? Really remember her? Margaret smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. They will. Those who knew her will remember, and those who didn't. They'll know her story now. Stories like Laura's echo. They teach, they warn, and they inspire. Carter knelt beside them, her gaze thoughtful. Sometimes it takes decades, but truth has a way of finding its way out of the shadows, and when it does, it matters. Every life, every story deserves that. Every one. For a long while, the three of them watched the water, listening to the distant cries of gulls, the soft rush of waves against the shore, and the quiet heartbeat of the memorial. It was a sacred private moment, a final reckoning not in the courtroom, but in the heart of those who had fought tirelessly to honor a life cut tragically short. Margaret glanced at Carter. "Do you ever regret anything? Staying on the case for so long, putting yourself through all of it?" Carter shook her head. "No. Every day was worth it, for her, for every victim who doesn't have a voice. That's why we do this work. That's why we keep going when it feels hopeless. And sometimes even decades later you get to see that justice, no matter how delayed, can finally arrive." Margaret nodded, eyes moist. "I hope other families fighting cold cases know that. That perseverance matters." "They will," Carter said. "And if they don't, at least you and I do. And that counts for something." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden glow across Lake Erie, Margaret, Emily, and Carter lingered a little longer. The light reflected off the water, shimmering and shifting with the gentle movement of the waves. In that quiet, sacred space, the weight of decades of fear, grief, and struggle seemed to lift just slightly. Margaret's gaze lingered on the bench, on the engraved name of her sister. "I think she would be proud," she whispered. "She would," Carter affirmed softly. "And we made sure the world hears her story. That's what matters. That's the legacy we leave behind." Emily leaned against her mother, and together they watched the water, feeling a small measure of peace settle over them. In that moment, the past, though heavy with sorrow, seemed reconciled with the present, a bridge between what was lost and what had finally been restored. As they stood to leave, Carter placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Remember," she said quietly, "some lives echo forever. All we can do is make sure the world hears them." The camera of memory drifts with them, leaving the memorial bench, the golden light of the late afternoon reflecting off Lake Erie, and the faint sound of waves carrying the echo of a life remembered, justice served, and a legacy preserved. And somewhere, in the quiet heart of Cleveland and beyond, the story of Laura Bennett, the girl who fought, who dreamed, and who ultimately inspired a city to confront its shadows, continues to resonate, quietly demanding that no voice, no matter how silenced, is ever truly lost. For anyone watching, reflecting on her story, if you were in Margaret or Carter's shoes, would you have had the courage to pursue the truth for decades, knowing the risks, the obstacles, and the heartbreak? Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.